And it was partly Maritian's work on the nature of the artist and the artifact that kind of liberated her to continue to do the great work that she did. Thomas Merton, when he was at Columbia, picked up art and scholasticism in a New York bookstore, and it was the beginning of his conversion to Catholicism. He would go on to write a thesis on Blake that was influenced by Maritian's work. Dana Gioia, the great contemporary Catholic poet, refers to Maritian, particularly his work, Creative Intuition, Art and Poetry, as an accurate description of what he's doing when he writes poetry. And perhaps the greatest contemporary testimony comes from Seamus Heaney, who wrote an essay where he goes through the stages of his process and uses the categories that Maritian develops in Creative Intuition. I got interested in the idea for this project because lots of Thomists have written about Maritian. Is he faithful to Aquinas? What does he do that's new? How does the system work together? Nobody had really written on Maritian and kind of applied Maritian, taking particular artists. So I've got a chapter on the two artists I mainly focus on. There was a beat poet from San Francisco in the middle of the last century who became a Dominican, William Everson, who was Brother Antoninus, was a brother in St. Albert's in Oakland for about a decade, left the order, died reconciled, and is buried in the Dominican graveyard there, but wrote really brilliant religious poetry for about 10 years. In fact, one of the scholars out at Stanford calls him the most important religious poet in America, or in the English language, in the second half of the 20th century. Eliot would be the one in the first half. So I've got a chapter on him and then Rouault. I started with this beautiful image. I'm going to back up and I'm going to talk a little bit about some images and read some passages. This comes from a work that Georges Rouault did. He was a lifelong Catholic and wrote this, not wrote, but painted and then wrote as their text, this work called the Miserere, which comes from the opening line of Psalm 51, which in the liturgy of the church we recite every Friday morning at morning prayer. It was also the favorite of the Psalms of St. Francis. He was known to recite this publicly very often. It is a penitential psalm, which is why it's recited on Friday morning. And Rouault compiled these series of plates, etchings, engravings, which he started working on in the 1920s and actually didn't finish until the 50s, and they were finally exhibited in the late 40s and early 50s publicly. And there's a series of these plates, and I want to take you through a little bit of this. I'm going to take you back to the beginning. So here we have the Miserere. Have mercy on me, God, according to your great mercy. And we have the top and the bottom divided up, in some sense, according to the medieval view of the divine world and the sublunary world, right? The mutable world beneath the moon. And notice that, because this will become important, this series of prints is divided into two halves. There's a different version of this that begins the second half. Notice that Christ is depicted here in the lower half in a posture that Rouault very often uses for the depiction of Christ, which is with his head slightly bowed. And in my PowerPoint that I sent to Mitch, in the framing, there are English translations which don't show up here. So we're going to get the French, and if my French is rusty, there are people here who can help me. But this is Jesus despised. And notice the disposition, once again, the slightly bowed disposition there. Always flagellated or tortured. Take refuge in your heart, you wanderer of misfortune. Notice here that that we've shifted from images of Christ to an image of a man with a child, but again, the bodily posture of the man is quite similar to that of Christ. So you've got these three images, and he'll do this throughout where the mirroring goes back and forth. So our condition imitates Christ, but in the incarnation, what Christ takes on is something that imitates our condition. So see this going in different directions. Also crucial to the whole series, as we'll see toward the end of the first part, is Veronica's veil. So Veronica's veil shows up at a number of crucial points in the series of prints. You all know the tradition of Veronica's veil, and Veronica's name, of course, means true image. So Rouault is, in a sense, addressing this large question of how we think about images in our time and how we think about images being true or false. So we have here, this is where I want to back up for a second to talk a little bit about some philosophical and theological issues. So Rouault's living at a time, he's composing this right after the end of the First World War, which sent shockwaves through all of Europe. Sent shockwaves through all of Europe because people, when they went off to fight the war, thought it was going to be over quickly. It dragged on, and it was horrendously barbaric. You expect war to be bad. It was horrendously barbaric. This had an especially shocking impact upon people in Europe because we were living what? We were living an advanced, progressive, rationalist, technological society. And this had suddenly bred, especially through the technology of modern warfare, had bred horrors you could not imagine. So the First World War, even well before the Second World War and Nazism, had sent shockwaves through Europe that made people deeply doubt the modern proclamations about progress, about freedom, and about reason. The very tools that we had used to emancipate ourselves from various kinds of encumbrances, our very calculating reason that had given us so many scientific and technological advances, had, in a sense, backfired on us. So that what we experienced was not progress, but regress. Not civilization, but barbarism. Right? And in fact, I'll read a passage from Rouault where he identifies certain elements in modern civilization as a kind of barbarism. So Rouault is writing, and because he's also writing, but painting at this time when Europe is attempting to come to terms with, in a sense, a public defeat of Enlightenment boasting about the powers of reason on their own to liberate us. He's also living at a time when the connection between images and reality is being put in question. So this is very much a feature of our that we tend to be suspicious between images that are real world. And we have an obsession in our contemporary culture with getting to the real and the unscripted that's behind the image. Right? This is a feature that comes out of Romanticism, the idea that we can get back to that which is unscripted, that which is untouched by human beings, that which is pure and authentic. And a lot of our, I think even in the television world, the first reality TV show was an MTV. Is MTV still exist? I don't know if it even still exists, but I think it does somewhere. It used to be a big deal. There was a show called The Real World about a bunch of teens, and I remember when it first was up and running, you could go to a website to get the real story behind the real world. And an awful lot of what we're after in our popular culture is getting at that which stands behind what's been presented, to what's authentic or to what's real. Of course, this question about images and whether they attach to reality or not goes all the way back, right? It's there in Plato's Republic, in the great allegory of the cave, where you have these individuals who are tied up and looking ahead at them, seeing images that are reflected on the wall and thinking what? These are real things, right? Confusing images with real things. And the process of liberal education for Plato is a matter of moving out from images to deeper and deeper encounters with reality. Plato's got as dark as that seems in the cave and as bleak as it seems, Plato's actually got a really optimistic view, right? Because Plato's view is that those images actually point to real things. And if you follow out the mirroring, you can get up to the ultimate reality, the image of the sun or the good or whatever it is in Plato. In the modern period, we're tempted to think that images just refer to other images in a kind of circle or cycle in which we're trapped, right? And this is because of the loss of any sense. We think of images and not of signs, right? Signs are things that point to what's transcendent or to an original. We doubt in our culture whether there's anything that's really original. We're tempted to think that it's just a series of constructs that can be manipulated in order to move people in certain directions, right? So we're always tempted to think that politics is basically will to power, right? It's always been about power, but that it's at its basis will to power. It's just about manipulating images. Veronica, the true image, right? That's paradoxical in itself to call something a true image, because an image reflects something that's more fully true, right? So there's something about Veronica, the name, and the image that she carries, right, of Christ in his passion, that is supposed to be a key for is, I think, dealing with that here. Okay, so let's go on to, this is a series of 3 prints here. These are really striking if you see them in the original. Are we not all convicts? Supposing ourselves kings, who does not wear a mask? So 3. It's hard to say whether Rouault actually has all of these things sequenced. You can get sort of mini sequences in here. So let me go back and just, are we not all convicts? We're guilty. Supposing ourselves kings. Look at that leering grin. Not wear a mask. Rouault was fascinated, especially in his early painting before he started this series, with human types. Prostitutes, judges, and clowns. His prostitutes, there are no images of, although there's one where there's a word play that might indicate a prostitute. His prostitutes, and sometimes he does nude prostitutes, but the physical formation of the bodies is distorted in order to bring out certain truths that, and there's nothing, unlike the sort of, if you know the history of art, the sort of late 19th century depictions of Olympia, who is frequently depicted in a very alluring posture, looking naked and looking directly at the camera. Rouault's prostitutes are physically beaten up, dejected. So he's not, in his depiction of prostitutes, unlike many other late 19th century, early 20th century Parisian painters, he's not after titillation in the depiction or allurement. He's after the effects on the body of the distortions of the soul in the prostitutes. Right? Similarly with judges, we'll see a lawyer come up in a moment, and clowns. And Rouault has written really interestingly about clowns. Here's a passage from 1905, which is before he started the series. It talks about seeing in a wagon being pulled by a horse, an old clown seated on the corner mending his glittering and colorful costumes. The contrast of brilliant, scintillating things made to amuse us in this life of infinite sadness. I saw clearly that the clown was me. It was us. The rich and sequin costume given to us by life. We are all clowns more or less. We all wear a sequined costume. We all wear a mask. But if we are caught unawares, as I surprised the clown, oh, those who would dare to say that he is not moved to the bottom of his being by immeasurable pity, I leave no one in his glittering, regardless of whether he is a king or emperor. I want to see the soul of man in front of me, and the greater he is, the more mankind glorifies him, the more I fear for his soul. So this theme in Rouault of the mask and the clown as someone who puts on a glittering, joyous face, but who behind that is suffering from infinite sadness, is a theme that runs through much of Rouault's own painting. A number of other themes I think you can think of here in this sequence of, this is the honest question, right? Are we not all, to some extent, guilty or convicts? But don't we all suppose that we're kings and present ourselves as kings? Who does not wear a mask? There's a great line from Eliot's love song, A Jail for Prufrock, where he says, there will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. Right? This sense in which we construct images for the outer world that are not accurate representations of, not truthful representations of who we are. Right? So the problem of the image goes in two directions. One problem of the image is, does it refer to anything real? Or does it just refer in a kind of a room of mirrors? Is it just images reflecting images? The other way in which images are problematic is directed inward, not outward, but inward. What I put forward is this: am I setting out to deceive others and to deceive myself, right? Because at some level, I do believe I'm a king. Right? I present myself in such a way that I want other people to think of me in the way I sometimes think of myself, which means that at the root of at least one part of the problem of images in our time is self-deception. Right? It's not just that they're images that are put before us in advertising or whatever it might be that are trying to dupe us into doing something we otherwise might not do, but also that our way socially of presenting ourselves to one another is problematic. This raises a bigger question about art. Rouault is both deeply traditional, so he was trained in stained glass early in his life, and said that he would like his art to be remembered like the artisans of the cathedral, right? In a kind of anonymous way. He's also got a very deeply personal, distinctive style, and he's using the latest in artistic methods in the early 20th century. So you have someone here who is deeply traditional and deeply innovative. He's doing both of these things. And it makes it possible to say that someone can be a contemporary artist and yet deeply faithful, because Rouault pulled this off. But he's also interested in some of the contemporary themes about the way in which we engage images that don't really engage on a deep level. Right? So you get this this tendency in art in the 20th century to say that art ought to attack, or ought to protest, or ought to stand against something. It ought to attack the bourgeoisie and make them wake up. Right? Well, Rouault partly agrees with that. He doesn't think that most of the artists who set about doing that have much to say or to show, other than a negative critique of what they see in front of them. But Rouault is concerned about the proliferation of images, much more so in our time than in Rouault's time. I mean, the photograph starts this, and then you have movies, right? And now we have social media. But the way in which images can be pliable to our own will, right? Let me connect this up with this contemporary writer at the University of Virginia, Matt Crawford, who talks about social media as tempting us to think of the universe in a frictionless way. What does he mean by that? Well, this is, according to Freud, right, and in this is something that Freud got right, the pleasure principle, which is our desire just to have what we want and is dominant in children, comes up against what? The reality principle. Right? And so becoming an adult is learning how to navigate and respond to the way in which the world and other people push back against your will. Well, what is social media? What is the internet? What is all our time on screens? If I don't like something, I just hit that, right? So I can stay in circles where I completely agree with people. I can see images that I find pleasing or that I want to see. I think the word is a great word, frictionless, right? It's where my encounter with other things doesn't push back. There's no friction, right? Another way to put this, which would be closer to Rouault, is to say that this is to present and use images in an idolatrous way. Right? This is the idolatry of the image, so that the image suits my expectations and serves my desires. That's an idol, right? That's the image as idol. It's not the image as icon, right? It's not the true image, Veronica, right, which is the true icon. What does the true icon do? The true icon looks back at me in a way that forces me to alter my, or invites me, or challenges me to alter my desires, right? So that instead of the image serving my desires are, and my attention is brought out into something greater and deeper and more significant than the desires I have antecedently brought to the image, right? So that I'm drawn out into a transcendent, infinite world instead of the image being pulled in and contracted to my will. Well, Rouault is very much aware of this problem of the image and the problem of our vanity and idolatry. Right? The problem of vanity and idolatry is that we are, in fact, all guilty convicts, but we suppose ourselves kings, and in order to get other people to believe that we're kings, we wear masks. Right? Notice that if we're following along with this, which is, it has a religious title from Psalm 51, but it's not necessarily, certainly not exclusively religious art. Right? And if we go further back, we find what he's doing here is to alternate between images of Christ and images of ordinary humans. Okay? But in order for us to be affected by the art in the way that Rouault hopes, we also have to be accused by it. Right? So this sequence of three, I have to say at some level, yeah, this is me. I'm a convict. I think of myself as a king, and I wear masks in order to get other people to agree with that self-assessment. Now, we have a bunch of images here. I'm not going to talk about all of them because there are more than 50 in this. That's another one that looks like Christ, but that's just an ordinary human being, but the same sort of posture. Right? It would be sweet to love. This is the woman of joy, is the language that was used for prostitution. Yeah, this is an upper class woman who is certain that her place in heaven is reserved. Now, we move away from that opening triptych where we need to accuse ourselves. We go through a series of upper class women. Now we have an accused man. The condemned man is taken away. And his lawyer is totally unknowing. So his lawyer is indifferent to the fate of the accused. Now we're back to Christ. Under a Jesus on the cross, totally forgotten. So all of this is going on in the upper echelons of society. I think everything that's preceded is viewed by Rouault as being under Jesus on the cross, but forgotten, unknown. He was mistreated and oppressed, yet he said, "Open not his mouth." The avenue of solitary or loneliness. That's really a beautiful image. All right. There are tiers of things, which for those of you who know Virgil, that's a line from Aeneas going to the underworld. But notice, I mean, here you've got a bunch of skulls in a room, yet those who believe in me shall not die, but will live. And then this, which is actually in the original especially striking, sing matins, the day has been renewed. The first image we who are baptized into his death. Love one another. Then this image. Lord, it is you, I recognize you. So that all these images that alternate between Christ and ordinary people, here at this point, toward the end of the first half, they're brought together. Right? Brought together what? This is pulling from the Supper at Emmaus and maybe Doubting Thomas, right? Lord, it is you, I recognize you. But for the first time, it's not Christ in separate images and other human beings in separate images, but Christ and the wanderer, right? The person who encounters Christ and recognizes him. And Veronica, with her soft linen, passes along the way. That's the end of the first half. Is Veronica's veil, which is an image of Christ wearing the crown of thorns. The true image. Let me jump ahead and say something that you may find crazy. So we've got some other images of Veronica's veil that show up on walls. There's one, and then there's one, the De Profundis. So we've got these images. Now notice what Rouault is doing here. So I talked about this problem of images referring to other images. So we've got an image of Veronica's veil within an image, right? Which itself refers to an image, right? So we've got the image here that's within this overall image that he's constructed. So he's got a room with an image on the wall, which is Veronica's veil. You got an image within an image, which refers to another image, which is actually the real Veronica's veil, which itself refers to he who is the image of the invisible God, right, from Colossians, Christ, the image of the invisible God. So you've got, Rouault, I think at some level, is really not playing with, but deeply reflecting upon the way in which images in our culture seem to be dead ends, seem to only reflect us, or seem to only reflect other images. This is a pretty complicated set of images. An image within an image, that's an image of an image, that's the image of the invisible God. Why the icon? Veronica's veil? Because it is the image of the one who is the image of the invisible God. And who is that God incarnate? Right? So the theme of Veronica and the symbolism of Veronica's name as true icon or true image is, I think, on one level, Rouault's response to this crisis of images in modernity. But what Rouault sees within that is that this is partly a crisis in our souls. It's not just a crisis it's both a crisis of philosophy, right? Do these images refer to things that are real? Is there something transcendent by reference to which we ought to understand all of the images around us? There's that. It's also a crisis of our own souls because we're constructing images of ourselves that are false, which we use to deceive others and to deceive ourselves to keep self-knowledge at bay. And we're also treating images in our culture in a systematically idolatrous way. Because the images that I'm most attracted to, the images that seem to pervade our culture increasingly, are images that I manipulate to serve my desires. So for Rouault, both the goal of true art and the goal of religious devotion is turning us from idolatrous encounters with images to images that are iconic. This is at once an intellectual, a moral, and a spiritual conversion, right? Which is why the whole thing is framed under Psalm 51. Jacques Maritian, when he writes about the series of prints and the focus on Veronica, says that Veronica's veil is the imprint of divine mercy on art. So that Veronica's veil becomes both a key to understanding the teaching of the gospel, but it also becomes a way of understanding how art ought to function. So that art ought to move us out of idolatrous encounters with images and into some sort of encounter with the transcendent. I'll take you to the end here, and then I'm going to read a couple passages, and then I will, just one passage, and then I'll stop. So you have these last three images. In our time of injustice and unbelief, the lady of the ends of the earth remains vigilant. So you have a Marian image. This is the closest image in the entire sequence to what we might consider a traditional icon. Right? It's framed, looks like a sort of traditional Byzantine icon. The images aren't distorted. You've got the sort of circle with Mary and the Christ child, right? And you have the effect of the light around that. Sorry, wrong way. Obedient unto death, even death on a cross, by his wounds healed. Again, Veronica's veil, but here more brutal in some ways, right? Because you can see streaks of blood in the forehead, and the crown of thorns is more prominent than it was in the earlier, indicating that our living in accord with the true image is going to involve penance of the sort that Christ endured on Good Friday. Right? Another way to put that, there's a literary critic, Northrop Frye, who wrote a lot of great stuff a while ago. But at one point he says that the Christian story is a comedy with a tragedy in its penultimate act. And one of the things that Rouault is concerned about well before the gospel of success was being preached on American TV is the way in which we want to skip the tragedy or the passion and go straight to Easter Sunday. Right? This is a way of not having to. It's a way of avoiding the self-knowledge that he invites us to earlier in this section. Just one last comment, and this is a little bit more about Maritian and his wife Raissa. So they met. Neither of them is Catholic, and were studying at the Sorbonne, both studying philosophy. And at one point, what they were being taught in philosophy, they realized the upshot of it was that all moral language was empty, that there was no point and purpose to human life, and they're standing on a bridge in Paris and make this remarkable suicide pact that they agreed to one another as they were walking across this bridge, that if within a year they did not find some purpose in life, they would jointly commit suicide. That this pact that they would not accept, could not accept the fact that this life was a mere comedy, not in the sense Northrop Frye was talking about it, not a divine comedy, but a kind of mocking comedy, where human aspiration, human desire for knowledge and love made no sense. Fortunately, during that year, for them and for us and for Georges Rouault, they met a professor at the Sorbonne who was not a Catholic, but who got them back into a kind of realistic view of being, where they started to think that they could actually know something about the world. And then eventually, they both converted. So they're very much taken with the way in which modernity seems to, let me go back to one other, I wanted to go ahead. Let's go ahead to something with color. You've been looking at black and white too long. Painting of Veronica that Rouault did. And then an image of Christ very much in the same posture as we saw earlier, but here in a kind of glorious color. Another great image of Christ being mocked and interrogated. And another image there. It's these gorgeous. So he was capable of moving from really striking black and white to glorious color. The last thing I'll say about this is that here's an artist like the Maritians trying to come to terms with the way in which parts of modernity seem to undermine the very foundations that we need to rely upon to believe in truth, love, and beauty. This did not mean for them that the ugliness and disorders of modern society were simply discounted or set aside. In fact, as you can see from the Miserere, what Rouault wants to do is to bring Christ down into the midst of that disorder, that confusion, that vanity, that desperation of desire, and get people to see how their very lives start to take on a meaning and purpose and shape when juxtaposed to Christ and then in the encounter with Christ. He moves from early focus on the disorders of society in prostitutes, judges, and clowns, through this Miserere, which is a kind of penitential art of his own, to these glorious depictions of Christ and of Veronica with the most serene, saintly face that you could imagine. He's also here dealing with the problem of the image in art, particularly as it pertains to the human face, which is nearly banished from art in the first half of the 20th century. Artists have almost no interest in the human face, and if they do, they have distorted it and desegregated its parts in such a way that it's barely recognizably human. As you can see, Rouault is not painting in a way that is what we might call realistic, if we have a kind of simple view of what realism is. But what he was after, and Maritan's the one who picks this up, is a surface distortion leads us to the deeper reality. The deeper reality of disorder and the deeper reality of spiritual glory. Thanks.
We got plenty of time for Q&A.
Yes, sir.
I have a question, maybe an observation. Was the artist in World War I?
No, he was not.
But he must have been pretty much, he was in Paris.
Right.
The war was all around it. He must
Right.
have really seen, in a sense, seen the war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're in the yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I just wondered because there's an English architectural historian who's put out a recent book, and he's wondered why modern architecture took off after World War I. These very simple, brutal, really kind of oppressive buildings that we've been living with now for generations.
Yeah.
And he's discovered that psychologists have determined that one of the symptoms of post-traumatic syndrome is simplicity. You have to have visual simplicity. It really bothers you to see complexity. And to me, his work is very, very simple. I mean, really childlike in its drafting quality. And I wonder if he, in reaction to World War I, what he saw the horror of World War I up close as he must have been in Paris, if he was suffering in a sense from a post-traumatic stress syndrome. Perhaps that's why his art took that course.
It could be. There are scenes which I skipped over, images which I skipped over, war which is despised by mothers, and then a scene of a son going off. And this, "Arise, you dead," is the line that was used to the people in the front lines going into battle. Right? And he's got skeletons here, so that's a pretty striking judgment on. And it does have the kind of simplicity that you were talking about. I think some of the later stuff, the color, has density and complexity to it that you don't see in this earlier.
Next question?
Yeah, please.
Thank you for your talk. The last line you said was, a surface distortion leads to deeper reality. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah.
And at the beginning, you mentioned about Flannery O'Connor. And Flannery O'Connor has very much in her writings, I think a lot of times uses almost a distortion where it's
Right.
shocking in some
Right.
cases. Do you mind just reflecting on that, using a little bit, drawing on what you talked about tonight, but also with Flannery O'Connor, just as an effective use of...
Yeah, and they're similar. In this respect, they're similar. And in Flannery, right, the activity of grace is almost always preceded by some crazy incident of violence, right, in the short stories. It might be somebody sitting in a waiting room throwing a book at the head of another woman sitting across from her. It's almost always some scene of violence. In William Everson, Brother Antoninus, whom I mentioned earlier, actually his poetry is very much that way. It's around violence and nature, which presents an occasion for grace. And I think that's similar in Rouault. So you could talk about two things there, right? You could talk about the way in which violence is an occasion for grace in the scriptures. You could also talk about the way in which we even ourselves experience grace as a kind of violence. Underscore experience because of the disorder of our souls. Right? So that when grace comes to transform us, we resist. We experience it sometimes as a kind of violence because it is moving us from sinful, disordered passions and habits and ways of seeing the world to something else. So it is not violent in itself, but we experience it subjectively as a kind of violence because of the antecedent disorder in us. Both Flannery and Georges Rouault think that their audiences are deeply disordered, but are increasingly oblivious of their disorder. So what is an artist who has that point of view to do? Right? Well, Flannery says, to the deaf, you've got to shout. And that's my audience. So to wake up the audience, to get the audience to actually engage with what is being presented, requires a surface distortion that makes us unsure whether part of the problem with an idolatrous encounter with images is that I'm sure that all my capacities right now are all I need to appreciate what's in front of me and to make accurate judgments about it. Well, if my soul is as disordered as Flannery or Georges Rouault or Maritian thinks, then that needs to be put into question, right? My assumption that I'm well positioned to make judgments about things, especially about myself. So that's why I take that sequence of 3 early here, right, to be, okay, if you really want to come along with me and see where Veronica's going to take us, then you need to accuse yourself and admit to yourself that you're not only don't know, but until you've encountered this, you didn't know that you didn't know. You're ignorant of your own ignorance. Right?
I'm going to let this gentleman ask the question first.
So in that issue of the idolatry of the image, today we have the phenomenon of people going to some amazing natural site or meeting some famous person, and most important thing about that experience is getting the photo or the selfie.
Right.
What would Maritian think of that? Or what would his observation on that phenomenon be?
Yeah, there's a line from Pascal, and all these French guys read. That was one of the people they read all the time. But where he says we really only want to experience things so we can tell other people about the experience. Yeah, that idea of, and we're constantly recording it rather than experiencing it nowadays, right? I mean, that's the awful thing about traveling anywhere in Europe, is you've just got people with selfie sticks everywhere and recording every moment, so that we're abstracted in a way from the immediacy of our experience in a way this is a story that I loved about 8 years ago, I think it was, where there was a young woman in New York who was walking with her phone through the city and fell into an open manhole cover. And, in the ancient world, you had, I think it was Thales who was walking and fell into a ditch looking up at the heavens. And people laughed at him as he's abstracted. He's looking at these other things. At least that he was looking at something that was real, right? We're now all abstracted in the way ancient philosophers were, but we're not pondering the beauty of the cosmos. So there's that, and then there's the other theme, which is connected to what you said, where Walker Percy's theme from the moviegoer about how being somewhere where there's a movie star or where a movie has been made somehow validates. People don't watch movies like they did in the old days, and they don't matter as much. But where it validated the experience. Why? Because it had been recorded and presented somewhere. So this idea of copies substituting for the real there's a lot to be said there. I don't think all of it's evil or horrible. I like to take pictures to preserve them of things, but I do think I do find myself sometimes being somewhere and thinking, well, I'm going to take a picture of that and send it to my family or something. And I realize there's a danger there that the immediacy of and enrichment of the experience is lost, or using GPS to go everywhere, even after you've lived somewhere for a long time, right? So it's just this, well, let's just look at where we're going and figure it out that way. So a very good question.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick at one thing you said historically, that World War I was barbaric, but it really was World War II that was barbaric. World War I was quite courtly. It was soldiers fighting soldiers. It was mechanized slaughter. That's what was horrible about it.
Yeah.
But they would dare on civilian areas. We deliberately firebombed cities and incinerated women and children and old people. You know, that was barbarous.
So I agree with you on that. And what I meant there was that the experience of it for Europeans who thought that this was going to be over quickly and had no idea that they would hear the stories coming back from the front. So I think what World War I did in the culture after was make possible an even greater barbarism. It made people less affected by it. And that's the sort of thing so to present the shock of it in Rouault and in many artists, the great virtue of Rouault is that he realized, and partly because he's read Pascal really carefully, right, that the experience of disorder presupposes some apprehension of order, right? So when Pascal gives this long litany of examples of our wretchedness, the way in which we don't live in the present, the way in which we don't really want to experience things, we just want to tell other people stuff because that's rooted in our vanity, which supersedes our interest in actually experiencing things. When Pascal's writing about that, he says at one point, all these examples of wretchedness prove human greatness. It is the wretchedness of a dispossessed king. The very fact that we are disturbed by disorder is an indication that we have some apprehension of what order might look like, right? What a lot of people in the time that Rouault was doing these paintings, and then later Maritian in the 40s is writing about, there are all these people writing about liberal education in the early 40s, just as the war is really getting known and everybody's coming into it. Hannah Arendt, C.S. Lewis, Maritian's book, there are a number of others writing about war and liberal education. Why? Because they're worried that the very things that in World War II were going to be the source of our victory, namely our technical expertise and our technological superiority, would be the things that would cause us to lose by winning. They worried that the excessive reliance upon technique and technology would eviscerate our language so that we would have a harder time naming what was missing. Right? I mean, one way to describe the problem of our current culture is that we don't have the vocabulary to name what's missing. We sense that things are really a mess, and we've got little superficial interpretations we can put on those. But naming what's missing in the way Maritian was doing in his writings, in the way Lewis does in his writings, in the way Rouault and other great artists in the first half of the 20th century were trying to do, they were not just worried about what was missing, they were worried that we were losing the ability to name what was missing and even to have that question resonate in our souls. That's what this art is designed to try and assuage or correct.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering if you could comment on the Catholic context that gives birth to this art, or in what sense it can be. I don't know that I want to ask so much how is it Catholic, but ask for your comments on the fact that, I mean, what you see in this series is the very rich palette that he has to draw on, precisely because he's beginning with a psalm that has a liturgical context and a long tradition behind it, the images of Christ, allusions to the New Testament, Veronica's icon, or Veronica's veil. It's kind of a very, very rich background material that he's then able to work with, in contrast to other 20th century artists who, in a way, don't want to enter into any of those subjects, and therefore are, in a way, working with a much reduced range of material.
Yeah. So it's those resources that Rouault is confident provide the language, the stories, the practices, the truths that help us to understand the human condition, where it's deficient, and how it might be remedied. Right? Veronica passes along the way. We can meet Veronica along the way if we're disposed rightly and can see rightly. And he has resources that other artists who were equally as talented didn't have. And this is one of the ways in which Rouault's innovation is deeply rooted in tradition. Right? There's something of the stained glass, even in the technique that he's using, but in terms of how he thinks we are going to come to understand the human condition, that's thoroughly rooted in the Catholic tradition, right? The Catholic liturgical tradition of prayer and sacrament, and also the Catholic tradition of icons. Right? It's rooted in that, and he sees, I think, as I was trying to say earlier, he sees that understanding, the religious understanding of the icon, as also providing a corrective to what ails art. So if art tries to depart from that completely, it ends up undermining itself, right? And you get an art that is merely novel. I mean, both Maritian and Rouault think that artists are attempting to do something new. Right? I mean, the great late medieval Giotto is trying to outdo, in some sense, his predecessors, Michelangelo. But they're working in a tradition where you could actually talk about progress and development because they were apprentices to these other great artists, right? So there is something that the artist is trying to do that's new, but when novelty becomes the goal for its own sake, the artist ceases to have anything to say, or it becomes merely a naysaying, right? A critique of whatever conventions happen to be in front of us, or a mimicking of it. Rouault's not really interested in that, right? He's interested in art that retains its deep traditional goal of depicting reality so that we come to understand it and encounter it much more deeply, and where it's reconnected to its religious inspiration and roots. And in his case, that's all Catholic.
Please join me in thanking our speaker.
Thanks.
Just a brief concluding word. This is the fourth and final installment of the co-sponsored series here at CIC with the Mystic Institute. So we're thanks to Mitch Boersma, to Father Charles, to all those who have made this possible. A word too about following up. If you would like to listen to other Mystic Institute lectures, you can find them on the Mystic Institute podcast. If you're interested in getting a kind of brief but comprehensive formation in the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, you can check out Aquinas 101, which is a program we just started here this fall. And then for future upcoming DC events for the Mystic Institute, we have two scheduled at St. Charles Borromeo across the river in Arlington for February and for April. And the series there ongoing, 2 installments in the fall and 2 installments in the spring, is about the human person. So we just had a kind of introductory anthropology and then a talk about the image of God. And those that are yet to come concern friendship and the polity. So you can check out the website for those and other related things. Thanks so much. The reception will continue until 8 p.m. and we hope to chat with you there. Cheers.
Thanks.